Tokyo Bay, September 2nd, 1945. On the deck of the USS Missouri, Japanese officials sign the instrument of surrender as representatives from 9 allied nations watch in silence. Anchored nearby, the battleship Nagato sits alone in Yokosuka harbor, her guns silent, her hull streaked with rust and camouflage paint, potted pine trees still fixed to her superstructure from a desperate attempt to hide her from American bombers. She is the last surviving battleship of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Just 4 years earlier, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had directed the attack on Pearl Harbor from her bridge. Now she waits under American guard, her fate uncertain. The question facing the Allies was simple but loaded with consequence. What do you do with the remnants of a fleet that once dominated the Pacific? The answer would involve nuclear fire, shallow graves at Kure, and a systematic erasure so complete that by 1947, not a single Japanese battleship would remain afloat. The story of the Imperial. Japanese Navy's battleship fleet begins in the early 20th century, when Japan embarked on an ambitious program of naval expansion modeled on the British Royal Navy. Japan's victory over the Russian Empire at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905 had established the nation as a Pacific power, and Admiral Togo Heihachiro became a national hero whose tactics would influence Japanese naval thinking for the next 4 decades. The decisive fleet engagement, a single climactic battle that would destroy an enemy fleet and determine the outcome of a war, became the central organizing principle of Japanese naval strategy. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 limited Japanese capital ship construction to a ratio of 3 ships for every 5 built by the United States and Britain. Japanese negotiators accepted these unfavorable terms reluctantly, recognizing that an unrestricted arms race with the industrially dominant United States would be financially ruinous. But the treaty also constrained China and the Soviet Union, and Tokyo's naval planners compensated for the tonnage limitations through engineering innovation and intensive training. If Japan could not match American numbers, her ships would be individually superior, her crews better trained, her tactics more aggressive. The interwar period saw extensive modernization of Japan's existing battleship fleet. The 4 Kongo-class vessels, originally designed by British naval architect George Thurston and built between 1911 and 1915, underwent 2 major reconstructions that transformed them from lightly armored battlecruisers into fast battleships capable of 30 knots. Their pagoda-style superstructures, built up layer upon layer with fire control stations, searchlight platforms, and command facilities, gave them a distinctive appearance that became iconic of Japanese capital ships. The older Fuso and Issei classes received similar treatment, their armor strengthened, their propulsion systems upgraded, their anti-aircraft armament increased to meet the growing threat from aviation. When Japan withdrew from the Washington and London naval treaties in 1936, the Imperial Navy immediately began work on a new class of battleships designed without treaty restrictions. The result was the Yamato class, conceived to be so powerful that no combination of American battleships could defeat them. By the time Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the Imperial Navy operated a fleet of 12 battleships, ranging from the veteran Kongo-class fast battleships to the revolutionary Yamato-class super battleships commissioned just weeks before the war began. Or the Yamato and her sister ship Musashi represented the pinnacle of battleship design. Displacing nearly 72,000 tons at full load, they carried 9 460mm guns, the largest naval artillery ever mounted on a warship, capable of hurling 1,460-kilogram shells over 42 kilometers. Their construction had been conducted in extreme secrecy, with American intelligence only learning of their existence by name in late 1942 and drastically underestimating their specifications. Yet, these magnificent vessels were born into an era that had already moved beyond them. The attack on Pearl Harbor itself demonstrated that aircraft carriers, not battleships, would decide the Pacific War. Throughout the conflict, Japan's battleship fleet saw surprisingly limited action. Fuel shortages, the constant threat of American submarines, and the overriding value placed on preserving these symbols of national power kept most of them in port or relegated to secondary duties. The Yamato spent much of her career shuttling between naval bases at Brunei, Truk, and Kure, occasionally serving as a troop transport because her thick armor and extensive storage capacity made her useful for ferrying reinforcements to threatened garrisons. American sailors sometimes called her a floating hotel, unaware that the most powerful warship ever built was being kept in reserve for a decisive battle that would never come. The destruction of Japan's battleship fleet unfolded in stages over the final 18 months of the war. At midway in June 1942, the battleships remained too far from the action to participate, while Japan lost 4 irreplaceable aircraft carriers. The naval battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942 claimed the fast battleships Hiei and Kirishima, sunk in night actions against American surface forces. The following year, an accidental magazine explosion destroyed the Mutsu while she lay at anchor in Hiroshima Bay, killing over 1,000 crew members in one of the war's most closely guarded secrets. The decisive moment came at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history. Japan committed virtually its entire remaining fleet in a complex operation to destroy the American invasion force in the Philippines. The results were catastrophic. On 24 October, American carrier aircraft swarmed the super battleship Musashi in the Sibuyan Sea, striking her with an estimated 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs over the course of several hours before she finally capsized and sank, taking over 1,000 crew members to the bottom. The battleships Fuso and Yamashiro met their end that same week at Surigao Strait, caught in a textbook crossing the T ambush by American battleships, many of them veterans raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor. The fast battleship Congo survived Leyte only to be torpedoed and sunk by the submarine USS Ceylon 3 weeks later while returning to Japan. By early 1945, Japan's once proud battleship fleet had been reduced to a handful of damaged and fuel-starved survivors huddled in home waters. The Yamato remained operational, but chronic fuel shortages in the home islands meant she could barely conduct training exercises. The hybrid battleship carriers Issei and Hyuga, converted after Midway to carry float planes from their stern flight decks, had never operated aircraft in combat due to the shortage of pilots and machines. The fast battleship Haruna and the veteran Nagato completed the list, all of them reduced to floating anti-aircraft batteries anchored near the naval base at Kure. The Yamato met her end on 7th April 1945 in an operation the Japanese themselves called a suicide mission. With American forces landing on Okinawa, the Imperial Navy conceived a final desperate plan. Yamato would sail with only enough fuel for a one-way voyage, beach herself on the Okinawan coast, and use her massive guns as shore artillery until destroyed. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, commanding the Surface Special Attack Force, initially objected to the mission as futile and wasteful, but orders came directly from Emperor Hirohito himself. The battleship sortied from Tokuyama with the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, carrying only 2,500 tons of fuel oil, enough to reach Okinawa but not to return. American submarines tracked the force from the moment it entered the Bungo Strait, transmitting contact reports that Yamato's own radio operators intercepted. There would be no surprise. On the morning of 7th April, nearly 400 American carrier aircraft from Task Force 58 descended on the Japanese formation. Over the course of 2 hours, the Yamato absorbed 10 torpedo hits and 7 bomb strikes, her anti-aircraft guns filling the sky with tracers as she twisted and turned in desperate evasion. At 14:23, a massive explosion in her forward magazines broke the ship in two. The blast was visible from over 100 miles away, and a mushroom cloud rose 6 kilometers into the sky. Of her crew of approximately 2,700 men, only 276 survived. The largest and most powerful battleship ever built had lasted just 4 years in service and had never engaged an enemy battleship in combat. The survivors at Kure fared little better. By July 1945, the remnants of the Imperial Japanese Navy had gathered near the major naval base, immobilized by fuel shortages and reduced to stationary. Anti-aircraft batteries. The battleships were anchored in shallow water, their crews largely dispersed ashore to man anti-aircraft positions on surrounding hills. Many of their secondary guns had been removed and emplaced as coast defense weapons. The ships were heavily camouflaged with paint schemes designed to break up their outlines and covered with netting and vegetation to blend with the surrounding landscape from aerial observation. In late July 1945, Vice Admiral John McCain's Task Force 38 conducted a series of massive air raids on the naval base, specifically targeting the remaining Japanese capital ships. Admiral William Halsey had overruled McCain's initial objections that the immobilized ships posed no threat worth the cost of the attack. For Halsey, the destruction of the Japanese fleet at Kure would avenge Pearl Harbor and ensure that no battleship survived to become a focus for Japanese nationalism after the war. On 24 July, over 1,700 American aircraft sorties struck targets across the inland sea. The attacking pilots faced intense anti-aircraft fire from both ship-mounted and shore-based guns, but the Japanese lacked sufficient fighter aircraft to mount an effective defense. Captain Genda Minoru, who had helped plan the Pearl Harbor attack, now commanded the 343rd Naval Air Group, attempting to defend Kure with 54 Kawanishi N1K2J Shirankai fighters, but they could not stop the waves of American aircraft. The battleships Ise, Hyuga, and Haruna, all heavily camouflaged with painted patterns and vegetation, were hit repeatedly and settled in the shallow anchorage. Haruna received a single bomb hit on 24 July that caused only light damage, but the attacks continued. On 28 July, she took 8 more bombs and sank at her moorings, killing 65 of her crew. She was the only one of the 4 Congo-class ships to survive into 1945, but her survival would be measured in days rather than months. The ice absorbed at least 16 bombs over 2 days of attacks. Her commanding officer, Captain Kakuro Mutaguchi, killed along with approximately 50 crewmen on 24 July before additional strikes on 28 July sent her to the bottom on a 15-degree list to starboard. Hyuga received 10 direct hits on 24 July alone, killing over 200 sailors, including Rear Admiral Kiyoshi Kusakawa, before settling to the bottom. The shallow water meant their superstructures remained visible above the surface, a forest of twisted steel and scorched pagoda masts marking where the Imperial Navy had died. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, only the Nagato remained afloat among the battleships. She had survived the Kure raids through elaborate camouflage, her funnel and mainmast removed to alter her silhouette, her decks covered with netting and potted plants to blend with the surrounding shoreline. American planners had made a special effort to locate and destroy her because of her symbolic role in the Pearl Harbor attack, but she had evaded detection. On 30 August, sailors from the USS Iowa boarded the battleship at Yokosuka, and Captain Thomas Flynn assumed command. Nagato's Japanese crew remained aboard under guard, their vessel now a prize of war. The Allied occupation of Japan brought immediate and systematic demilitarization. Under the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, all Japanese military forces were to be dissolved and their equipment surrendered or destroyed. The Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, General Douglas MacArthur, established strict guidelines. Japan would retain no capacity for war. Naval vessels, military installations, and defense industries were to be eliminated. Industries primarily military in character were to be completely dismantled, while Japan was to be deprived of heavy industry capacity in excess of normal peacetime requirements. The British Commonwealth Occupation Force, headquartered at Kure, took primary responsibility for supervising the disposal of Japan's war industries, including the scrapping of the remaining fleet. Australian, British, Indian, and New Zealand personnel began deployment to Japan in February 1946, eventually numbering about 40,000 at peak strength. American forces retained overall control of the occupation, but the Commonwealth forces handled much of the practical work of demilitarization in Western Japan, including supervision of the naval dockyards where so many of Japan's warships had been built. The task facing the occupation authorities was enormous. Never before in history had such a comprehensive demilitarization been attempted. Beyond the battleships, Japan still possessed hundreds of smaller warships, thousands of aircraft, and millions of small arms, all of which had to be accounted for and disposed of. The naval technical mission teams that swept through Japanese facilities in the weeks after surrender discovered extensive documentation on ship construction, weapons development, and operational planning. This intelligence was shipped to Washington, London, and other Allied capitals, where analysts pored over Japanese engineering achievements and tactical innovations. The wrecks at Kure presented both a challenge and an opportunity. The battleships Ise, Hyuga, and Haruna lay in shallow water, their hulls largely intact despite the damage from bombing. In the immediate post-war period, Japan faced acute shortages of steel and raw materials for reconstruction. The sunken warships represented thousands of tons of high-quality steel, copper, and other metals that could be salvaged and recycled into bridges, buildings, and civilian machinery. The decision was made to raise and scrap them in place. The work began in 1946 under the supervision of American authorities and was carried out by Japanese salvage companies, primarily the Harima Zosen Corporation, operating from the Kura dockyard. The Haruna was raised first, her hull cut apart piece by piece with torches and heavy machinery. Workers who had built these ships during the war now dismantled them, feeding the metal into furnaces that would produce steel for Japan's recovery. The scrapping of Icey proceeded from October 1946 to July 1947, her underwater sections left in place and broken apart without raising the hull. Hyuga followed on a similar timeline, her wreck removed between July 1946 and July 1947. By the summer of 1947, the three battleships had been reduced to raw materials, their steel flowing into the reconstruction of the nation they had once defended. The Nagato alone escaped the scrappers' torch at Kure, but her fate was no less dramatic. In the autumn of 1945, American naval officials debated what to do with the captured battleship. She was far too old and damaged to serve in the United States Navy, which already had a surplus of more modern battleships being decommissioned after the war. Returning her to Japan was unthinkable given the occupation's demilitarization objectives. Some suggested preserving her as a war memorial, perhaps moored near the USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor as a symbol of reconciliation. But the Navy had other plans. Since August 1945, military planners had been developing Operation Crossroads, a series of nuclear weapons tests designed to evaluate the effects of atomic bombs on naval vessels. The tests represented the Navy's response to claims that atomic weapons had rendered surface fleets obsolete. If bombs like those dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki could sink a fleet, what was the point of maintaining expensive battleships and aircraft carriers? The Navy needed data to counter these arguments and to understand how to protect its ships in an atomic war. The tests would take place at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands, a remote ring of coral islands with a total landmass of only about 2 square miles. The atoll's isolation made it ideal for the purpose, though its selection required the forced relocation of 167 Micronesian inhabitants who had lived there for generations. Commodore Ben Wyatt, military governor of the Marshall Islands, visited Bikini in February 1946 and asked the residents to leave so the United States could test bombs for the good of mankind. After church on a Sunday, their leader King Judah announced that they would go, believing that everything was in the hands of God. They were told the relocation would be temporary, but they have never returned. Subsequent nuclear testing rendered the atoll unfit for habitation, and as of 2026, it remains uninhabited. Nagato was selected to participate in Operation Crossroads alongside the American aircraft carrier Saratoga, the battleships Arkansas, Pennsylvania, and New York, the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen captured from Germany, and dozens of cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and support vessels. A target fleet of 95 ships was assembled in Bikini Lagoon, supplemented by a support fleet of over 150 vessels and more than 42,000 military and scientific personnel. The tests were the first nuclear detonations since the ER bombing of Nagasaki and the first to be publicly announced in advance, with hundreds of reporters, politicians, and international observers invited to witness the explosions. In March 1946, an American crew of approximately 180 men took possession of Nagato and began preparing her for the voyage to Bikini. Her condition was poor. The hull had not been repaired from underwater damage sustained during the July 1945 air raids, and she leaked so badly that her pumps could not keep up. Only 2 of her 4 propeller shafts were operational, limiting her speed to just 10 knots. A Japanese crew remained aboard under American supervision to help operate the ship's systems. The journey from Yokosuka to Bikini Atoll, with stops at Eniwetok, took several weeks, the battered battleship creaking and groaning across the Pacific one final time. On July 1, 1946, the first test, codenamed Able, sent a nuclear bomb plunging from a B-29 bomber to detonate 520 feet above the target fleet. The bomb missed its intended aim point by approximately 1,500 feet, perhaps due to a collapsed tail fin, reducing its effectiveness against the central targets. Nagato survived, suffering only moderate damage despite her position relatively close to the blast. 5 ships sank immediately, but many others remained afloat with heavy topside damage. crews reboarded the surviving ships within days to prepare them for the second test, despite concerns about radioactive contamination that were not yet fully understood. On 25th July, the Baker shot detonated 90 feet underwater, suspended beneath the landing ship LSM-60. The explosion vaporized the landing ship and created a colossal column of radioactive water over 2,000 feet wide and more than a mile high, topped by a mushroom cloud that rose into the stratosphere. The underwater blast proved far more destructive than the airburst, sinking the battleship Arkansas, the carrier Saratoga, several submarines, and the Japanese submarine E-201. Chemist Glenn Seaborg, who would become the longest-serving chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, later called the Baker test the world's first nuclear disaster because of the extensive radioactive contamination it spread across the lagoon. Nagato again survived the initial blast, but the underwater detonation had ruptured her hull in multiple places. Her already compromised pumping systems could not handle the additional flooding. Over the following days, progressive flooding gradually pulled her under. On the night of 29th July 1946, 5 days after the Baker test, the last Japanese battleship capsized and sank in the radioactive waters of Bikini Lagoon. She went down without ceremony, observed only by American sailors monitoring the contaminated target fleet from a safe distance. The ship that had once served as Admiral Yamamoto's flagship, from whose bridge he had directed the attack on Pearl Harbor, ended her career as a data point in nuclear weapons research. The sinking of Nagato closed the final chapter on Japan's battleship era, but the broader disposal of the Imperial Navy continued throughout the late 1940s. Surviving smaller warships faced various fates depending on their condition and utility. Some destroyers and escorts were pressed into service as repatriation transports, ferrying millions of Japanese soldiers and civilians home from scattered garrisons across the Pacific and Asia. The old training carrier, Hosho, commissioned in 1922 as the world's first purpose-built aircraft carrier, spent her final months bringing Japanese personnel home from overseas before being scrapped in 1946. The light carrier Katsuragi, one of only 2 carriers to survive the war largely intact, performed similar duty before demolition in 1947. A small number of surviving vessels found unexpected second lives. Minesweepers and patrol craft, essential for clearing the tens of thousands of mines laid in Japanese waters during the war, were retained under American supervision and later transferred to the newly formed Maritime Safety Agency in 1948. This organization, predecessor to the modern Japan Coast Guard, represented the first tentative step toward rebuilding Japan's maritime capabilities. The minesweeping mission was critical and dangerous. American forces had laid approximately 100,000 mines in Japanese waters during the summer of 1945, designed to strangle the home islands in preparation for the invasion that never came. These mines, both moored and influence-activated, blocked harbors, shipping lanes, and fishing grounds essential to Japan's recovery. Former Imperial Navy sailors, now working under the supervision of the Second Bureau of the Demobilization Ministry, operated the minesweeping vessels that cleared these deadly obstructions. The work continued for years, with casualties among the minesweeping crews as worn-out equipment and unstable ordnance took their toll. The dangerous work of minesweeping continued until the early 1950s, with former Imperial Navy sailors operating under American direction to make their home waters safe for merchant shipping. By one accounting, over 53 minesweepers participated in the effort at its peak, clearing channels that allowed Japan to resume the maritime trade essential to its economic survival. The skills and organizational structures developed in the minesweeping service would form the foundation for Japan's eventual rearmament. The occupation authorities took particular care to ensure that no focus for nationalist revival would emerge from the remnants of the fleet. Museums were forbidden from displaying military artifacts that might glorify Japan's wartime past. Ship models, flags, and personal effects of naval officers were collected and destroyed or sent abroad. The famous chrysanthemum crests that had adorned the bows of imperial warships were removed and melted down. The message was clear. The Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist not just as a fighting force, but as an institution, and its symbols would not survive to inspire future generations. The 1947 Constitution, drafted under American supervision, formalized this transformation. Article 9 declared that the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and prohibited the maintenance of war potential. Japan would have no army, no navy, no air force. The country that had built some of the most powerful warships in history would rely entirely on American protection for its security. The old naval bases at Yokosuka, Kure, and Sasebo became American installations, their dry docks and workshops now servicing the ships of the United States Pacific Fleet. The Cold War brought gradual changes to this arrangement. The outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 led American planners to reconsider Japan's total disarmament. By 1952, the Safety Security Force was established, incorporating minesweeping vessels and surplus American destroyers into a nascent coastal defense capability. 2 years later, the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force formally came into existence, carefully designated a self-defense organization rather than a navy. Its first vessels were American hand-me-downs, including destroyers and submarines transferred under the Mutual Defense Assistance Program. No Japanese battleships would ever sail again. The physical remnants of the battleship fleet scattered across the Pacific, now resting on the seabed as monuments to a lost era of naval warfare. Yamato lies in approximately 340 meters of water northwest of Okinawa, her hull broken into two main sections by the magazine explosion that destroyed her. The wreck was located by survey vessels in the 1980s and confirmed through manned submersible dives in 1999. Subsequent expeditions have documented the debris field, finding artifacts ranging from the ship's massive anchor chains to personal effects of her crew. The site remains largely undisturbed, considered a war grave by both Japanese and American. Authorities and commercial salvage operations are prohibited. Musashi rests even deeper in over 1,000 meters of water in the Sibuyan Sea, her wreck discovered in 2015 by a research team funded by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen. The Shinano, the third Yamato-class hull converted to an aircraft carrier and torpedoed by the submarine USS Archerfish just 10 days after commissioning, lies somewhere off the coast of Japan, her exact position uncertain. Nagato remains at Bikini Atoll, one of the most significant wrecks in the lagoon that became a graveyard for major warships of multiple nations. The radioactive contamination that lingered after Operation Crossroads kept the site largely unexplored for decades, but in recent years, recreational divers have begun visiting the wreck. She lies upside down in about 55 meters of water, her hull encrusted with coral, her massive 410mm gun turrets having fallen away when she capsized. Nearby rest the American vessels that shared her. Fate, the carrier Saratoga, the battleship Arkansas, submarines and destroyers, all silent witnesses to the dawn of the nuclear age. In Japan today, no original battleship survives as a museum ship or memorial. The systematic scrapping of the fleet and the occupation's restrictions on military commemoration ensured that these vessels exist only in photographs, models, and the memories of those who served aboard them. The Yamato Museum in Kyoto, opened in 2005, features a massive 1:10 scale model of the super battleship, painstakingly constructed using original blueprints recovered after the war. The museum tells the story of Japan's naval history with careful attention to the suffering of those who served, avoiding glorification while preserving the engineering achievements and human experiences of the battleship era. The legacy of Japan's battleships endures in unexpected ways. The Yamato in particular has become a cultural icon, appearing in films, anime, and video games as a symbol of a lost era. The famous space battleship Yamato anime series, first broadcast in 1974, imagined the wreck raised from the ocean floor and converted into an interstellar warship to save humanity from alien invasion. The imagery resonated with a generation of Japanese viewers, transforming a symbol of military defeat into one of hope and redemption. Whether this represents healthy processing of historical trauma or problematic nostalgia remains a subject of ongoing debate among historians and cultural critics. What happened to the Japanese battleships after World War II was, in many ways, inevitable. These magnificent vessels represented the apex of a technology that had already been surpassed by the aircraft carrier and the submarine. Their destruction, whether in combat by nuclear test or through systematic scrapping, reflected the broader transformation of Japan from militarist empire to pacifist democracy. The steel that once formed their hulls became bridges and buildings in a reconstructed nation. The sailors who survived them went home to families and civilian careers, their wartime service a memory that faded with each passing decade. Yet something is lost when we reduce these ships to mere statistics of displacement and armament, to tonnage scrapped and lives expended. Each battleship carried thousands of men who lived, worked, fought, and died within her steel compartments. The Yamato's final crew included teenagers pressed into service as the Empire collapsed, boys who had never fired a gun in anger before American torpedoes began striking home. The engineers who raised and scrapped the wrecks at Kure were often the same men who had built these vessels during the war, dismantling with their own hands the work of their younger selves. The destruction of a fleet is also the end of a way of life, of a naval tradition stretching back to the days when Japan first sought to match the Western powers on the seas. If you found this video insightful, watch what happened to the German U-boats. After WW2 next, a deep look at how the submarine fleet was captured, divided among the Allies, and scattered across the world in the aftermath of the war. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more History Inside. Thanks for watching.